Hello, I'm Gabriella Kelly-Davies, and welcome to Biographers in Conversation, a podcast about the many choices biographers make while researching, writing, and publishing life stories. In this first episode of Biographers in Conversation, I'm chatting with Peter FitzSimons about his gripping biography of Sydney Opera House and the experiences of the people who conceived, designed, and built it. Sydney Opera House is a breathtaking building, recognised around the world as a symbol of modern Australia. A World Heritage Site, it's celebrated for its architectural grandeur and the innovation of its design. Yet its construction was plagued by controversy, scandals, betrayal, professional rivalry, sexual intrigue, murder, bullying, and destroyed lives. Peter, welcome.
Thank you, Gabriella, and thank you for that kind introduction.
What inspired you to write the Opera House?
Look, as I look to my right over there right now, I can see the top of the Opera House. I'm lucky to live in a spot where on a morning walk or waking up, I can see it. And I've always looked at it. And I think I don't know you well enough to know that if I can swear on your podcast, but I'm going to risk it anyway. I wanted to call the book The Opera House, where the fuck did that thing come from anyway? And it is a legitimate question of the more I got into it, the more I looked at it, the more I read about it. Where the fuck did that thing come from? How is it that this exquisite architectural beauty that is really the most famous building of, since I stand to be corrected, but I think it's the most famous building since the Eiffel Tower, pretty much. So dot three, carry one, subtract two. It's the most famous building of the last 130 odd years. And part of its beauty, part of its staggering nature is even people like me, I'm not too architecture born. I don't really go out of my way anywhere I am in the world to go and see architectural wonders. I don't really talk about architecture to people much, or it's not my thing. But that thing, I've just always looked at it and gone, wow. And when you go into the actual story of it, 1950s Australia, 1950s Sydney, the gag was it was Manchester by the sea. It was pretty close to the dullest town on earth. You had, the people, the decision makers were living behind white picket fences. They had meat and three veg every day of their lives. They went to church on Sundays, not that there's anything wrong with that, but they lived very regulated, orthodox, straight down the line lives. And yet somehow, when they were presented with a scale model of the Opera House, they went, yeah, 14 old white men effectively. Yeah, we'll build that bastard. What about it? And so the idea of the book was, I've done biographies of many famous Australians, Nancy Wake, Charles Kingsford Smith, Douglas Morton, all kinds of people. And Nick Farr Jones, John Eales, Kim Beazley, they're all coming back to me. And the idea was to write a biography of a building, to say, well, this is where this came from. And there was a fellow in America that wrote a biography of the Brooklyn Bridge, and it's an American masterwork. And he'd walked over the Brooklyn Bridge every day of his life and thought, well, where did it come from? And he discovered he went, I think it was upstate New York. He discovered a shed where all the archives were, where all the stuff, and then he went through all the copies of the New York Times and was able to write the story. And so for me, that was the inspiration for writing the book of the Opera House. And as you sort of you did note in your introduction, it goes so much more, the story goes much more beyond architecture and engineering. There is sexual intrigue, there's murders, there's all kinds of extraordinary things that have gone into that building.
Yes, I love the way you opened the book with stories of the Gadigal people, the first inhabitants of the sacred site of Bennelong Point, where Sydney Opera House is located. Why did you choose this approach? And did you experiment with various openings before settling on this one?
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, I mentioned biographies that I've done. One of them is Captain Cook. And one of the points that I make in my book on Captain Cook is that biographies are not just freestanding they're written, you write history through the prism of the time in which you write it. And when I was writing the biography of Captain Cook, one of my researchers came to me with this extraordinary scene that he had discovered in the archives, which was just before Cook sets foot on the shores of Botany Bay. He's in a longboat with 12 sailors, one of whom is his nephew Isaac, and they're just about to land when they are confronted by two brave Indigenous warriors holding shields with spears, defending their land. Cook shouts at them, "Get out of the way, get out of the way." They don't move. He gets a musket. He fills it with buckshot and he fires between them. They don't move, and he loads it again, lines up the guy on the left and pulls the trigger, and it hits the shield, hits him in the thighs, and they move. And when I was confronted with this, I said, well, that can't be true. How could that this most iconic moment of colonisation, which is Whitefoot, an English foot about to set foot on the east coast of Australia, knowing that we now know that 18 years later, actual landing of a colony took place. I said, if that was true, we'd all know all about it. But it was true, and it was there, 3 different representations. Cook wrote about it in his diary. Why is it that most in Australia didn't know about that? Because when it had been written about previously, the master of the Cook biographies is a Kiwi by the name of Beaglehole. And Beaglehole was a brilliant biographer, put 40 years of his life into documenting the life and times of Captain Cook. And when he got through that particular episode that I write of, that I mention here, I think he wrote his account in 1962. And in 1962, in the prism of the times, white fella shoots black fella is worth half a paragraph. I think it was maybe 1 paragraph, 2 or 3 sentences. In my time, writing about that, when I was writing about it 2018, it was, he did what? What? That just can't, that's extraordinary. And the point being that I'm writing about it 60 years later, where we have much more awareness than we did then. White people, at least, have much more awareness of the horrors of what happened. It wasn't so much talked about back then. Now we get it better than we ever did. And so when I was writing about the Opera House, again, there's an awareness and an interest in our Black history, and in fact, I'd love to do somewhere down the track. I'd love to do with an Indigenous friend of mine a book which would be called, the black and white Australia, the good, the bad, and the very, very ugly. So my interest was where the Opera House stands. What's the Indigenous history there? And when you go into it, it is extraordinary. It was on that very spot that Bennelong, the man that Captain Phillip, he and Colby, Bennelong and Colby were 2 Indigenous men that were kidnapped. Colby got away in the end, and Bennelong got away, but then came back after having put a spear through Captain Phillip's shoulder. But then Phillip built him a hut, and on one night, I think it was late in the early months of 1790 from memory, Bennelong invited Phillip and his senior officers to come down, and they did a performance, effectively a corroboree, as the dusk fell and the fires came up, and they sat, and then I think it was 22 Indigenous men and some young boys performed a corroboree. It was a moment of awakening, an enlightenment of, they're all doing the same movements in the same time and singing the same song. This is like it's rehearsed. This is like they're just like us. And so the point being, this was a place of performance. And when I was at the Opera House last Wednesday night, and there was a welcome to country and an acknowledgement of our elders past and present on the land on which we meet. And I thought of that is on sacred ground. That was a meeting place it was an Indigenous meeting place, but it became also at that place there was so much tragic history, so much of when white colonisation took place. But that place, that was a happy evening, if you like. It was something where there was performance and a meeting of what became, well, Black and White Australia. And again, I'm aware, even as I'm speaking to you, I'm thinking I've got this, am I doing this right? Because it's sensitive territory, because there'd be other interpretations of that would take a much more negative view of that it was the white fellas encroaching on the black land, and it's like their damn hide to give Bennelong a hut when it's Bennelong's land in the first place. But I've had a nap, I've just woken up, and so I'm doing my best. But my point is to acknowledge that this was Indigenous land.
That's right, totally. The book is meticulously researched with 38 pages of notes and references. How did you research the book?
Over 5 years. So I do with all of my stuff. It's interesting that I suppose the way it evolves, because the best-selling book I ever did was on the Kokoda Track, and I did that 20 years ago, a couple of decades ago. And really, I reckon the research I put into that is about a 50th of the research that goes into my books now. Because back then I had walked the Kokoda Track. I had big chunk of files from the Sydney Morning Herald on Kokoda. I had books that had been done previously, and I just sort of nutted it out as I went along. These days, in the days of the internet and the ability to go really deep, you're obliged, if you're going to tell a story properly, I reckon you're obliged to go deep and to go wide. And I do it as a big budget operation. What happened? Because I had this moment must have been about 20, early in the millennium. I was doing a book on Les Darcy, the great Australian boxer who came to a tragic end in America. And I was outside down by our pool, and I had a thought. I wonder what happened to Les Darcy's best mate. I think his name was Eric Metcalf, and he lived in a place called Orlando Avenue in Singleton. And I thought, well, Les Darcy, when the First World War broke out, didn't go to war, but his mate Metcalf did. I wonder what happened to Metcalf. So I sent an email wirelessly, as you do, which was a big deal back then, to be sending something wirelessly, to my researcher in Canberra at the War Memorial, Glenda Lynch. Said, can you just look up this bloke? I got his name's Eric Metcalf, and I just happen to remember that he lived in Orlando Avenue, either Maitland or Singleton. Anyway, bing, 2 minutes later, because Glenda knows what she's doing, back came a PDF, and I didn't know what a PDF was at the time, but there was 98 pages of documentation in colour of his enlistment papers and his death notice. And I pressed Command P, which is also a big deal. And by the time I got back to the house, out of the printer was whirling 98 pages in colour of his whole thing. And I let's go through, and I looked, death 7th of August, 1915, at Gallipoli. And I knew from previous books, 7th of August was the infamous Battle of the Neck, where 4 waves of Australian soldiers charged to their certain deaths against Turkish machine guns. And I thought, Eric, he died in the battle of, that's extraordinary. And so I go to the account of what happened. And it was his sergeant in his company who said the shrapnel came and it took out his right jugular and the blood started spurting, and I put my hand on it, I couldn't stop it, so I put my fist on it and it was all over me, and then I kept pushing harder, and then he was dead. And the point being of telling that story, here I am, Johnny Dickhead, with I don't have particular research skills at all. I've got no research skills to speak of, but I hire people that know what they're doing. And in the age of the internet, I could have a stray thought. I wonder what happened to that bloke. And really within 10 minutes of having the stray thought of what happened to a bloke who died 100 years previously, I could be metaphorically bathed in his blood. And it was a revelation to me that the information that I want is there. It's in archives. And now it's digitalized. In fact, before I began the Kokoda book, a particular academic who'll remain nameless, let's just call him Dr. Peter Stanley, said to me, well, you'll have to move to Canberra to do this properly. You'll have to come down to Canberra. I think he said for 6 months. And I said, well, no, I won't be moving to Canberra for 6 months, but I'll hire an archivist, I'll hire a researcher to do it. And I did. And doing it like that I was able to get through on Kokoda by doing it. But in this day and age, I have researchers. I've got one in Albany. I've got one that lives in Mexico. I've got one that lives in Bowral, one in Canberra. And on different stuff, I say, well, this is what I'm interested in. Go deep, go wide. And they know by now what I'm looking for. What I'm particularly interested in is any account in any diary or letter that shows dialogue. I love dialogue because if you can show me who said what to whom when, I can build a scene around it. And you say, this is not, this is not imagined, stuff. This is what they said. And when I did my book on Ned Kelly, which by this time I was fully launched on this way of doing biography, where you go deep and wide and you do it, as I say, as a big budget operation to get the story. When Ned Kelly, I must have done it about 10 years ago, and I got the best review I've got in my life. And it was an academic from Melbourne. And he said the opening line of the review that he put in the Age was, this Ned Kelly book by FitzSimons has more emotional resonance than Peter Carey's book on the Kelly gang. Stew beauty. But he said, but with one rider. And he didn't, this is not the sentence that he used, but it was what it boiled down to. The rider, the qualification was, but FitzSimons makes shit up. And what did I make up? And he went through a story that at the Stringy Bar Creek massacre, I gave an account how when Ned Kelly and the Kelly gang broke from deep cover and said, put your hands up to the two policemen that were there. One policeman threw down his weapons. The other went for his gun. Ned Kelly from 40 yards away brings up his pistol, fires, and kills the man straight through the eye, through his left eye, and looks down upon him. It's Constable Lonigan, and he recognises Constable Lonigan as the man who 5 years previously, when Kelly had taken on 5 policemen at Benalla, and the only way that they'd been able to subdue Kelly was Constable Lonigan had pulled down his pants and grabbed him by the testicles and held on. And by my account, in my book, Kelly looks down upon Lonigan and he's had a pain in his testicles for 5 years. And suddenly, after killing him, his testicles no longer hurt. So in this review that this fellow put in the Age, he said that, fabulous account, fabulous anecdote, but there's no proof it actually happened. To which I wrote back to him and I said, sir, I'm not having a go at you because you've just given me, the best review of my life, and I thank you. However, can I point you to, I think it was the 2nd of October, Argus, page 3, top right-hand corner. There is the second last interview Kelly ever gave, and he talked about Constable Lonigan, how Constable Lonigan grabbed me in the most cruel and cowardly, disgusting manner, and I had pain in my nether regions right up until the day that I killed him. And so it's all there. And so the point being, what I do, one of my influences, and again, my researchers know to look for this. My sort of writing mentor is a guy called Gary Smith, who lives in South Carolina, and he was out here 20 years ago, and I sent him a piece of my writing, and he said, Peter, that thing has got so many sights, sounds, and smells, I can't believe it. And a light went on in my head, S, S, S. So right now, I'm well advanced on a book on Albert Jacka VC, the first winner of Victoria Cross at Gallipoli, an extraordinary man. And I've got 2 researchers going hard and 1 researcher going a bit.
Sensory.
And they know to look for S, S, S. What are the sights, sounds, and smells to build a scene? To say when Jacka was gassed in the end in May of 1918, just outside Villers-Bretonneux, finally ending his war, that's an important episode in the book. So, the sight, sound, smells. One of the smells is the sound is, they say that gas shells, most shells that land, shattering explosions. Gas shells, they all said it was a plop, plop, plop. It didn't explode. And the smell was the smell of burnt onions. Strange, isn't it? Mustard gas, burnt onions. But that's, my researchers know when they see that stuff, they highlight it. That's what the smell was.
That's extraordinary. And sensory detail is just critical for all writing, whether it's nonfiction or fiction. And it allows you, as you say, to recreate scenes. And that's the thing that fires up people's imaginations.
Well, this is, Gabriella, if I can say, one of my ways of doing it. So your listeners, if I say to them fiction and I say to them non-fiction, the tendency is to think of non-fiction as dry accounts, and on the 3rd of October, whereas fiction is flights of fancy. Miss Havisham came down the stairs, and Pip and Estella were there, and she gave Pip, etc. And the way I try to do it is to use the devices of fiction and apply them to non-fiction. So you get the sight, sound, smells, you get the dialogue. You're saying to the reader, the listener, this is what happened. I'm not making this shit up. This is what happened. And so when you're reading fiction, when you're reading Great Expectations by Dickens, which for me is the masterwork of the English language, to beat them all, it is fabulous. It is just the most unbelievable writing. Nevertheless, there's a small voice that whispers to you, this didn't happen. There was no Pip, there was no Estella, there was no Miss Havisham, there was no wedding cake. It's made up out of Dickens' extraordinarily fertile, wonderful brain. How much stronger is it in a book like my book on the shipwreck of the Batavia, or the Catalpa rescue, or when Mawson lands in Antarctica, or Scott of the Antarctic dies, with this extraordinary final scene? How much stronger is it if you've got the sight, sound, smells, you've got the dialogue from letters and diaries and final journals, and the reader going through it is able to go, geez, instead of the little voice saying, this didn't happen, you've got the big voice saying, this happened. And then for those who say, I don't believe it happened, well, go to the footnote, mate. Go to the footnote, 763, Scott's diary, 12th of August, 1912. This is what he said. It's an account of what happened. In fact, in that case, I think Scott was already dead by that date, but it's very close.
Yeah, well, it's quite interesting because using those novelistic devices, feeling what that character's feeling, seeing what they're seeing, and they feel like they're in the scene. And I think that's one of the secrets of good biography. Places the reader into the story, and it places the reader into the character, and so they feel like they are the character.
Thank you. Well, I love doing it. It's like a drug, and I occasionally take flack from people who don't like it, to which the answer is, I don't care. It is a literary drug. And it's the only way I know how to do it. Now, I did it in a different way 20 years ago, but I absolutely love doing it.
Yes.
Even as I'm talking to you now, you can see I'm mildly distracted, but my researcher in Albany's just come back with answers to the 32 questions I posed to this morning.
Now, with such forensic research, how do you narrow the biographical scope?
That's a very interesting question. The answer is that I don't narrow it to, I often start out with, for example, Douglas Mawson, Sir Douglas Mawson, who was the great Australian who landed in Antarctica at pretty much the same time, was of the era of Shackleton, Scott, and Amundsen. He was more than any of them a scientist and was not interested in planting flags on the South Pole. He wanted to research, to understand Antarctica. And when I was writing Mawson, I realised early on, this is a good story. This is a strong story, but it's not as strong as Scott of the Antarctic, and it's not as strong as Amundsen, and it's not as strong as Shackleton. They were all there in the same era. Sometimes, at some points, they were there in the same month, same time. And for me, I'm in it for the story. Even though I put Mawson on the cover, I'm in it for the story. I want the anecdotes. I want the sweeping drama of that period of exploration. So, but I've got a problem here, is that I've got Mawson on the cover, and I want to use the story of the death of Scott. How do I get around it? Very simply, I change the goalpost. I call it Sir Douglas Mawson and the Icemen of the Heroic Age. that gives me the justification. And remember Tim Bowden, who was an ABC guy. He's a very well-known broadcaster and fine man. I liked him. I do like him. But he did a review of my book on Mawson, and it was that he said FitzSimons shouldn't have written such a wide scope on all of these people. He should have kept it to Mawson. To which the answer is, thank you, Tim. Thank you. But here's the one. I'm the author. I get to choose what the subject is, and I choose this subject. And it's such a strong subject that I did exactly the same with Kingsford Smith. That I started out on Kingsford Smith and I realised that's a strong story. It's not as strong as the story of the Wright brothers or the story of the Red Baron, who Kingsford Smith flew against in the First World War, or Hinkler, or any of those. And so as I'm writing the story of Kingsford Smith, I widen it to be Sir Charles Kingsford Smith and those magnificent men in their flying machines. And that gives me the scope to go wide. I'm doing Jacka at the moment. I mentioned Albert Jacka. And at Gallipoli, the story of the Gallipoli landing, he was there, he got there that evening, not in the morning thereof. Pozières, Bullecourt, Polygon Wood. There are so many amazing things that are happening around Jacka. I'm thinking I'll call this the life and times of Albert Jacka VC, because I want those stories and I want it to be not just the narrow focus. And I frequently come across staggering accounts, staggering anecdotes that have nothing to do particularly with my biographical subject. I don't care. I want them in there. And so just last night, my researcher in Barrel, my cousin Angus FitzSimons, brought to my attention the fact that one of the generals that was overseeing the military actions in which Albert Jacka fought, General Godley, used to be in the boarding house in the same dorm as Rudyard Kipling. And it's just a fantastic, it says nothing. It says nothing about Albert Jacka, but I don't care. I want it in there. It fascinates me, and it gives the account colour, movement, interest, and snippets of everything, and I want them all there. And so what I do is I frequently, by the time all the research is done, like right now on Albert Jacka, my publisher's saying he wants 150,000 words. Well, that's good, but right now I've got 320,000 words, and part of the skill or the energy or the time will go into, all right, here's my 320,000 words. I've got space for 150. And in fact, I'm going to browbeat him into making it 180, because I'll say, this is so fantastic, this stuff. I don't want to cut it. And so, but again, I've learnt over the years to listen to the little voice. And sometimes you get, I talk to writers about, younger writers who occasionally ask me, well, how do you do it? And one of the answers is sometimes you'll have a little voice that says to you, I know you've worked on this particular half chapter, quarter chapter for a month, but it's very, very dull. And your big voice says, but I can't cut that. If I cut that, a month of my life will disappear onto the cutting room floor, effectively. The answer is listen to the little voice. Listen to the little voice. If the little voice is telling you that it's dull, cut it.
That's good advice. Now let's get back to Sydney Opera House. You wrote the narrative in present tense. Why did you choose present rather than past tense?
For a very good reason, it's a very astute of you, if I may say, to ask the question, because I often get asked, why I do it like that. And the answer is, again, Gary Smith, my sort of writing mentor, if you ever look him up, Gary Smith, Sports Illustrated, breathtaking writer. And the answer is when I first started writing, I wanted to have the reader, I wanted campfire narrative. Okay, so everybody bring it in tight, and I'll lean in and I'll say, it was a dark and stormy night. I'm the narrator. I'm telling you a story by the campfire. Everybody lean in. And that is strong. But much stronger is, it is a dark and stormy night. Suddenly, a clap of lightning, a clap of thunder, and lightning hits the ground. So if you go past tense, to put the reader in the moment, they have to go via the narrator. You've got to get through me to get back to the past tense. If I put it in present tense, it has much more immediacy. It's more like a novel, but it's backed by a footnote which says this actually happened.
That's great. I love it. I really love the way you did it. It gives immediacy. It makes the reader feel like they're in the scene, and it increases the dramatic tension.
Yeah, well, and again, thank you for saying that. Again, I note that it sometimes drives the academics, particularly academic reviewers, nuts, and I take some heat for it. I might have mentioned I don't care.
Well, let's get back to the Opera House again. And something that I'm really fascinated by is that you have complex architectural and engineering concepts, then translate that technical information into propulsive narrative for the general reader. Now, you're not an architect or an engineer. How did you get your head around it? And how did you then translate it?
Yeah, I've got my eldest brother, David, who's 13 years older than me, is an engineer. And so time and again, he'd come over here and I'd say, look, tell me again, I don't understand this structural stuff, and explain it to me so that I can explain it to my readers. And we'd go over it again and again and again. And then I would there was an elderly fellow, about 88 years old now, who'd come to the house regularly, or I'd have lunch with him regularly. And his name, to my shame, doesn't immediately pop into my head, but I'm 3 books later. And he was fantastic because he worked on the Opera House. He was there for many of the scenes that I describe. And and part of what I do is my daughter at the moment is the editor-in-chief of a website called The Daily Oz. And it's basically it's an Instagram platform for media and news, breaking news, or news of the day. And their motto, their motif is, I think it's now I get it, now I understand, something like that. And it's really good. I enjoy it. And I do a little bit the same in my historical writing, storytelling, which is not to assume knowledge, but to put in the building blocks of knowledge, to put it in what I write, so that the reader understands. And so when I was doing Kokoda, for example, to my shame, but it was the truth, when I was writing Kokoda, I did not know how many were in a platoon, how many were in a company, how many were in a battalion, how many were in a division. And I always get foggy on the rankings. I understand, you've got sergeant, you've got lance corporal, corporal, sergeant, lieutenant. And my father was a lieutenant in the Second World War, and I'm always majors and colonels. I'm always just a bit foggy where the major or the colonel's higher. I think it's colonel, and captains. And so I make sure that in my account, I build in that structure so that the reader you're able to tell the story in a manner where you're not assuming knowledge. You're weaving it in, but not doing it in the manner of a textbook, weaving it into the information. So in my early military books, I would be sure to have training scenes where, in the book I've got with on Albert Jacka, there's actual training scenes of pretty graphic stuff about when you bayonet a man, when you put a bayonet through somebody. No, but it's. I know you're wincing, but and I wince too. But it's fascinating to me. The account, the British textbook on bayoneting was, that how deep you had to put a bayonet before you'd kill a man, and make sure that it didn't go too deep because it'd be suction on, and if it did, you'd pull and you're just going, gee, this is shocking, but it's what happened. And if you can put that into your account, and sometimes you have to pull back because it's too gory, too graphic, but it is how extraordinary that they were taught. They were taught how deep to put a bayonet in and what to happen if the lungs would suck on it so much that you couldn't stick it out. You couldn't pull. You just go, geez, this is
Too much information.
Oh, I know. Okay, well, it's too much for you, and you'll probably cut it out of the podcast, and fair enough. But the point is to give the whole account historical accuracy is to a certain point, include the sheer ghastliness of it, because that's what it was like. And so one of my One of my, again, she's the late great Vonda Jamrosic, who was a great influence on me in my early days at the Sydney Morning Herald. She wrote this front page piece in my early days at the Herald in the late 80s, and it was about two Polish brothers who had come to Australia, and I think they were living in South Australia, and they'd built up a business, 250 employees, and they'd built it from absolutely nothing. And it was a really feel good, strong piece. And then right at the end, there was this ghastly, horrible, racist thing, a paragraph, two paragraphs right at the end, where they said, well, the only reason we came to Australia was we'd heard there were no blacks here. And I go, oh, geez, I love you blokes. And then you're saying something like that. What? And so I said to Vonda, geez, Vonda, that was such a great piece. That was such a feel good, great piece of writing. I really like those blokes. And then they said that. I said, why did you put that in? And she gave the brilliant answer, because that's what they said. That's what they said. So if you're giving an accurate representation of these people, that's what they said. And they were fundamentally good men with that shocking streak of racism in them. And Gary Smith's point to me, my writing mentor, is that people are complex. People have different layers of goodness and badness and rights and wrongs and why they are how they are. But that if you're going to be doing a biography, you have to, if you're doing it properly, you're covering the good, the bad, and the ugly. And when I was finishing my biography of Kim Beazley, the former opposition leader of the Labor Party in the latter part of the 90s, early part of the 2000s, I thought when I was getting near the end, I thought, geez, I can't find anybody that hates this bloke. I don't want this to be a hagiography. I want this to be real and honest. And so I thought, where can I find some bad information about Kim? I thought, oh no, I'll go to his first wife. There's always a good start to find the dirty laundry. And his first wife, Mary Cicciarelli, a fantastic woman, she said to me, well, look, I'd like to help you, but he's a very good man. She said the only reason the marriage fell apart was because his place of work was on the other side of the continent to the one that we were living in, Perth. He was working in Canberra. It was too hard. But generally, you want the good, the bad, the ugly, and you want to cover the complexity of people's characters.
Now that leads into a question that I'm very curious about. How did you choose to represent the main characters? So, for example, to what extent did you champion Jorn Utzon as the hero and represent Davis Hughes, the Minister for Public Works, as the villain? Or was the situation more complex and nuanced than this simplistic portrayal?
I don't think I did a simplistic portrayal at all, because it was they're complex people. But I made it absolutely clear for those who are coming to the Opera House late. Jorn Utzon was the Danish man, the Danish genius, who started, who conceived the whole idea of the Opera House, who championed it, who won the competition, who travelled to Australia. And in my eyes, he's a architectural genius to beat them all. However, I'm hoping it becomes clear in my portrayal that the same genius, the same brain that could conceive those sweeping lines of the Opera House that tore up, it doesn't look like any building ever built. The same brain that could do that was not the same brain that could manage a multifaceted building engineering works that to actually see the whole thing done. And I make clear in the book that at the time that he resigned, which was 1966, I think February 1966, he resigned. At that point, he had 6 designers, 6 draftspeople taking the stuff out of his brain and putting it on paper. And so he leaves, he goes to Sydney Airport, they replace him with 3 architects. It takes 7 years. And by the time they finish, they've got 118 draftspeople. So the point being that, and Davis Hughes, who's always put out as the bad man, the bogey man, and to a certain extent he was. On the other hand, it is not unreasonable to say we've got to get this done. We can't just have this going on for decades. We need production. We need a budget. We've got to finish it. And so the wonderful scene at the end is when Davis Hughes dies, it is Jørn Utzon who writes to his widow with great generosity of spirit and says, look, this building would not have been done if not for Davis Hughes, if you didn't have a hard head in there. And it was an extraordinary thing. You had this reckoning, what was it, 35 years later, that even Jørn Utzon doffed his lid to Davis Hughes. So that's an example of, it was not good man, bad man. It was brilliant man, bother boy politician, getting the job done.
Yes, I actually liked the way you ended the book, the epilogue, where you went through character by character and shared what had happened to them, because some of them ended up having terrible lives after the opera house was built. So I thought that was a really good way of ending. Why did you choose that ending?
Again, because I guess I like in my books, I always have an epilogue of, well, what happened to them afterwards. There's got to be a point where you finish it. I mean, with Albert Jacka VC, it's fairly obvious that the ending for the most of the book's got to come with the ending of the First World War. But it's very interesting what happened to him thereafter, that he became the hero of Victoria and a businessman, mayor of St Kilda, and then he died early in the 1930s, basically from damage done in the war with the gas and the rest of it, and his coffin was borne by 8 Victoria Cross winners. In the case of the Opera House, the fascinating thing with Utzon was, when it was built, he wasn't there. He never saw it again. He never, from the day that he left, he never saw the Opera House completed. And in the year just going into the year 2000, my editor at the Sydney Morning Herald, Robert Whitehead, wrote to Utzon and said, look, we want a big splash for the first day of the millennium. Here's the plan. We'll fly you into Sydney Airport. We'll put you up in a hotel, Botany Bay, 3:00 in the morning on the first day of January 2000. We'll get you in a boat. We'll bring you around the heads, bring you up the heads of Sydney Harbour. We'll film you as your eyes see the Opera House for the first time. Brilliant plan, brilliant idea, and it would be footage that to die for now. Utzon said, no, not coming. But how fascinating is that? And that's an example of, it's got nothing to do with the building of the Opera House per se, but it's fascinating what happened afterwards. Similarly, what I said with Davis Hughes, the fact that Utzon had a generosity of his spirit to write that to Lady Davis Hughes was really something.
I think it was also wonderful that he reconciled with the opera house managers.
Yep.
And that his son and he collaborated on the Western Promenade and also the Utzon Room. So I felt the story came full circle, and you represented that very well in talking about how gracious he was and how there was a reconciliation, and it was vital for that to happen. So
Yeah, thank you.
how did you represent the historical and political and social context of the times? Because it was a highly politicized, and congratulations on representing that so well.
I love those stories, the political stories. I mean, Joe Carl, who is under acknowledged for his role. Joe Carl was the premier of the time, and his idea of a good time on a Saturday night was having sausage sandwiches at Wentworth Park Dogs. He'd never been to an opera in his life, and he was putting huge money towards the Opera House. And there was a bit of an outcry, saying, well, why are we putting this for the big end of town? Why are we putting this money? And he said, because the Opera House is not for the big end of town. It's for the waitresses and the waiters and the carpenters and the unemployed and everybody. They'll have the finest of everything. And this Opera House has got to be open to the people. And the wonderful story in there that when Utzon lands and sees the building site for the first time, but after he's won the competition, they fly him in and he goes down to Bennelong Point and he's absolutely stunned. And he goes to see Premier Carl and he says, I'm absolutely knocked out by this building site. I can't wait to get started. However, there's a bit of a problem on the western shore of Bennelong Point, facing the bridge. There's working wharves. You can't have an opera house right by working wharves. And Premier Carl interrupts and says, just a moment, Mr. Utzon, if you please. Dorothy, just get me the Maritime Authority, please. Yeah, excuse me, Mr. Utzon. Yes, look, this is Premier Carl. Look, you've got working wharves on the western shores of Bennelong Point. They'll have to be gone by Christmas. No. They'll have to be gone by Christmas. Thank you. Make it happen. Puts the phone down. Says, sorry, Mr. Watson. So Premier Carl was the champion of Woodson, as in whatever you want, Mr. Woodson, will make it happen. When he died in office, the succeeding Labor Premier and then the succeeding Liberal Premier, Askin, Sir Robert Askin, didn't support him at all. Well, nowhere near to the extent of Carl. It was too far down the track for Askin to stop it, but he did want it to be finished. And there is an argument that, even with going hard and cutting corners, it still took, as I said, 7 years and 119 draftspeople and a budget that blew out remarkably.
That's right. So 4/5 of the budget was spent after Utzon left. I've just got one last question. What do you believe is the role of a biographer?
To capture the moment, to capture the wonder of the story. It is to basically, I said to my wife the other day, as I say, I keep coming back to Jacka. So even though I'm talking to you right now, just before I had my nap, and 10 seconds after I finish this, I'll be back to Jacka. And my head is right now in the Battle of Pozieres, where Jacka with 7 men charges 80 Germans. And it's, even though I'm with you, I'm not quite. My head is there. And the role of the biographer is to take us into the life of somebody and say, well, this is what it was like. This is why they did what they did. This is to see their times through their eyes and to, as much as possible, write it in a fashion so they experience what they can of their extraordinary lives.
Yes, I agree totally. Now, thank you, Peter, so much. This has been a fascinating conversation about the history of one of the world's most iconic buildings and one that's very, very close to my heart. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. I've had a lovely time. Bye-bye.
Peter FitzSimons described how he learned about complex architectural and engineering concepts, then translated this technical information for the general reader. He also outlined the novelistic devices he employed to create propulsive narratives and why he wrote the book in present rather than past tense. Peter explained why the narrative includes substantial dialogue and excerpts from parliamentary debates, minutes of meetings, correspondence and media coverage. He also revealed why he ended the Opera House with an epilogue that describes what happened to the major characters after Sydney Opera House opened. Thank you for listening to Biographers in Conversation. Thank you to my producer Tara Northcott and to Sonny Lauderdale for the music. I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land, and pay my respects to the elders, both past and present. We'd love you to leave us a review if you enjoyed the show. If you'd like more information about my guests, head over to biographersinconversation.com and read the show pages. I'm looking forward to our next conversation about the choices a biographer makes. I hope you are too.